both the partnerships that we've created and how change happens through partnership. So working with WinCam, working through the Winchester Historical Society, meeting different audiences, bringing folks together to have these discussions. That's what we do at the Network for Social Justice. That's the core of what we do. And I really believe that's the way social justice and social change happens. I'm really excited to be bringing this film to everyone tonight, and I think we'll talk a lot more about it, both the seismic event that it was at the time and the implications it's had for thinking about immigration and restrictive immigration moving forward, I think are so relevant, especially today, as we think about things that are happening related to Afghanistan, related to protests that are happening just today, actually, in Washington. So I do want to turn it over to Wei Han to say a few words and get us oriented.
Oh, hi, good evening. Yep, my name is Wei Han. I'm wearing multiple hats tonight, and I'm very honored and humble to be the president of Network for Social Justice, and a 30-year organization that has been dedicated for advocating for diversity and equity and building an inclusive community. And also that tonight I'm here, you can see my background, that I'm representing the Chinese American Network of Winchester as well, short for CanWin. It's a nonprofit and nonpartisan community organization for Chinese Americans in the town of Winchester, founded in 2016. We are aims to preserve and promote the Chinese cultural heritage, enhance neighborhood integration, and strengthen engagement in community affairs. As today, we're very proud that now we have at least 5 Chinese Americans serve in Winchester town meetings, and several other members serve in the various town committees and boards. And during last year, the peak of pandemic, that CanWin and Chinese residents here at Winchester, we donated over 45,000 masks, face shields, and protective gears to Winchester Fire Department, the Police Department, senior centers, and many rehab centers, and the Winchester Hospital, and many other local nursing homes and hospitals. So tonight, we have this, a very special occasion that, yesterday actually, is a Chinese Mid-Autumn Festival, also known as a Moon Festival. It's a traditional Chinese festival celebrated by many East and Southeast Asian countries. It's a significant holiday for family reunions. And all of us here tonight are fortunate enough for having this, opportunity to reunite with a special group of people, the Chinese immigrants to America 160 years ago. Thanks to the incredible efforts of the director and also producers of Li Shenyu and Rick Burns. I believe they already joined us. I saw Rick log in earlier. When I say incredible efforts, it's very with heartfelt and a deep sense of gratitude, because based on my understanding, there were several attempts to create a documentary for the Chinese Exclusion Act since mid-1900s. And there's just simply not a lot of information available, and not a lot of people knew about that act. And they literally, I think, to me, that in my eyes, they moved a mountain and created such beautiful work. And that really allow us for the first time to see those faces, to hear their feelings and the thoughts, listen to the voices, that they really come to life again tonight. And I hope that you can enjoy it. And they're probably going to, you're going to have a lot of questions, and maybe some questions can be answered, with this documentary film, and there are going to be more questions generated. Hopefully, through this documentary, we'll find, that some answers, and some of questions may have to be answered by all of us individually and collectively. Yeah, we sincerely hope that you're going to enjoy this documentary, and then we will have a lovely discussion with Director Yu and Director Burns later.
Thank you, Wei. That was really beautifully put and thought-provoking. And I think we're going to have to answer some of the questions together. I love that. I want to very quickly just share with everyone what the agenda is for tonight, so you can see sort of how you fit into this as well, and how we'll be managing questions. So the agenda for tonight is here. Sorry, low tech me. Coming is here. We've already heard our introductions. We will be now doing our film screening, and that's going to be about 45 minutes. And we'll show the 45-minute film in its entirety. This is being recorded. And so I do ask, and this is something that I hadn't thought of before, if you are uncomfortable in any way with your face or your voice being on a recording, feel free to put your question in the chat. No one's going to be asking their questions out, but also feel free to take yourself off video altogether if that's in any way an issue for you. After the film screening, we are going to have a very special welcome from the directors, Yu and Burns, who are with us tonight or will imminently be with us tonight. And we're going to ask them to share sort of their opening thoughts with us to start the conversation, to start the dialogue. Then we will have a question and answer period. I'm going to moderate the questions, and I am happy for anyone at any point during the film, or even if you already know your question now, to put that in the chat. I will take all the questions from the chat and I'll be asking them out. So there'll be no worry about, speaking out or being on camera if you don't want to be. And we'll go from there. We'll go from a roving list of questions. I'll try to take them in the order in which they're put into the chat. And then we will have a few closing words after the Q&A from the co-sponsors tonight. So I think without further ado, unless I have missed anything and I turn to my co-organizers, we can start with the film.
On June 30th, 1885, as the fundraising campaign for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty finally began to pick up speed, a letter appeared in the pages of the New York Sun. Written by a young Chinese immigrant and recent college graduate named Samsung Bo, who had come to America years earlier as a small boy and who dreamed of becoming a lawyer.
Sir, a paper was presented to me yesterday for subscription among my countrymen toward the pedestal fund of the Statue of Liberty. My countrymen and myself are honored in being thus appealed to as citizens in the cause of liberty. But the word liberty makes me think of the fact that this country is the land of liberty for all men of all nations, except the Chinese. That statue represents liberty holding a torch, which lights the passage of those of all nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? Are the Chinese here allowed to enjoy liberty as men of all other nationalities enjoy it? Free from the insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which men of other nationalities are free. By the law of this nation, a Chinaman cannot become a citizen. Whether this statute against the Chinese or the Statue of Liberty will be the more lasting monument to tell future ages of the liberty and greatness of this country, will be known only to future generations. Samsung Bo.
The solitary arm of the unfinished Statue of Liberty had languished on Madison Square in New York for more than 5 years, when on May 6, 1882, on the eve of the greatest wave of immigration in American history, President Chester A. Arthur signed into law an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was unlike any law enacted since the founding of the Republic. Singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion, it made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America, and for Chinese nationals already here ever to become citizens of the United States. Fueled by deep-seated tensions over race and class and national identity that had been festering since the founding of the Republic, it was the first in a long line of acts targeting the Chinese for exclusion, and it would remain in force for more than 60 years. It continues to shape the debate about what it means to be an American to this day.
Chinese Americans always have this identification with the founding principle of this country, so beautifully laid out by the founding fathers, and so eloquently articulated in the Declaration of Independence and in American Constitution. The Chinese identify with this fundamental principle of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And all men are created equal. Now, how can you say that this is a group of people who are biologically and culturally unfit to live a civilized life, to appreciate and practice American culture, political and religious ideals? That's why I think a lot of Americans had a hard time to learn that the Chinese Exclusion Act really exists for 60 years. They couldn't believe it. The government did that.
We have to remember that for most of the 19th century, immigration into the United States was basically open. You just showed up. So the Chinese exclusion law is one of the first really comprehensively restrictive laws. And it's also the first and only time in the entire history of the United States that a group is singled out by name, Chinese, by name, as being undesirable. So this is truly a remarkable moment.
If there is a word that defines the Chinese American experience and Asian American experience, it's exclusion. And not just because of the 15 laws passed by the United States Congress specifically against the Chinese, but also subsequent laws in the various states, especially here in California, and in local jurisdictions such as places like San Francisco, Los Angeles. All the major cities enact laws, including laws that actually expelled and purged the Chinese from its population.
Starting in California, the Chinese were marked as different. And I see the 1882 bill as a link in a chain of bills and a chain of legislation and race riots and purges that are trying to move the country toward ethnic cleansing. The 1882 bill was not about labor. I think it was about white purity. And how do we get rid of people who are different?
We focus a lot on the Exclusion Act from the point of view of racism. We can't help but talk about racism in the 19th century. But again, we come back to the fact that we haven't learned our lesson. We talk about 19th century and its racism as if it's in the past. It's all done with. No, it isn't. We have yet to resolve this in our 21st century.
I mean, history is complex and it's a mixed burden. We can talk about the war against the Chinese leveled by California, but we can also say that California was a laboratory for the larger process of adjustment that began nationally. There's very little in California that's exclusively Californian. Most of what goes on in California is America. Remember Wallace Stegner said about California, it's like the rest of the country, only more so.
Many people think of this exclusion law as being very racist, very unfair. But if you look at the world at that time, every country was like that, in almost every ethnicity. Try to be a citizen of China or try to be a citizen of Japan is impossible unless you're ethnically Chinese or Japanese. But this is a group of people, Chinese American, the Chinese that were here, who actually fought back and made America better than what it was and helped make America what it is today, the values that we have, including equal protection under the law, rights to education, what it means to be American, what makes you American, to be born here. All these weren't defined.
The 1882 exclusion law has been forgotten, but once we remember it, it is outrageous. And that's probably why we've forgotten it, because it is so outrageous. Many Americans today cannot believe this happened. We like to think that this is not an American thing to do. How could this country, in its culture, in its politics, in its economics, do what it did against a whole class of people? The exclusion law didn't say, oh, if you happen to be a Chinese citizen, you cannot come here anymore. It said that race of people are banned from this country. So it's a racial exclusion law. So that banning of a whole category of people directly challenges foundational questions of what American freedom means and what American history means, who we the people can constitute.
I think it's essential that Americans know about the exclusion of Chinese, not because it's the Chinese, but because it reflects how America has come to develop, how America saw itself at one time, and how it continues to see itself. The Chinese were the first to be excluded, but then all Asians were excluded eventually. So it sets the stage for people to understand that America is a gatekeeping country. We let some people in at some times, we don't let other people in at other times. It has much to do with the character of our national history. And that, to me, is the most important thing in understanding how we became who we are today. Some of it has to do with the fact that we excluded Chinese for 60 years.
So in California, they're trying to think of all kinds of ways to get rid of the Chinese without passing an exclusion law. But they're also lobbying in Congress to get an exclusion law passed.
Lawmakers in Congress, for their part, still led by radical Republicans, whose principles had been forged in the fight against slavery, continued to resist all efforts to get them to legislate against the Chinese on the basis of their race. But by 1875, the political dynamic in America had begun to shift, as Democrats in Washington began to understand that the Chinese issue could be indispensable to the post-Civil War rehabilitation of the Democratic Party. That year, with anti-Chinese sentiment at the state and local level on the rise, and a presidential election looming, California lawmakers redoubled their efforts to put pressure on Congress, shifting the debate from the issue of race to the issue of contract labor, widely seen across the country as another form of slavery.
The issue of Chinese labor becomes the very easy one to galvanize the constituents of the Democratic Party, working men in particular, many of whom come from European immigrant backgrounds, would have been working class, would have been concerned about what appeared to be the flooding of Chinese workers into the nation. The Democratic Party is seen as a protector of working men's rights and a guarantor of their opportunities. And that's where we don't have just simply a local story, but one that then has large national resonance.
The Democrats suggest that the Chinese labor were actually equivalent to black slaves, and really got the liberals in New England, pushed them against the wall. Look at all the slaves that they have here in the West Coast. So on the one hand, you had this political pressure against the Republicans because they were advocating for Chinese coolies. And on the other hand, the Chinese suddenly become a threat in some of the East Coast factories. They were using Chinese as strike breakers. And so that made it possible for the Exclusion movement to get the support from the East Coast politicians.
For the first time, a pathway to Chinese exclusion, stymied at the national level for 20 years, now began to open.
In 1875, Congress passes the Page Act, which is an effort to speak to the demands of the Californians without circumventing the Burlingame Treaty. The Page Act prohibits the immigration of people coming under contracts to work and prostitutes. Now, Chinese have been stereotyped already. All the men are coolies, all the women are prostitutes. So they think this is the way they're going to stop the Chinese immigration. And because contract workers and prostitutes are not defined as free immigrants, but as enslaved, they're not contradicting the terms of the Burlingame Treaty.
There developed this sexist, racist, misogynist attitude among Americans that Chinese women were naturally prone to become prostitutes. And therefore, the Chinese women who wanted to come to the U.S. had to prove that they were never prostitutes, that they weren't prostitutes then, nor would they ever become prostitutes. Now, of course, one can't prove what will not happen or happen in the future. So many women chose not to even go through that humiliation. So we have that first act that's passed that is very racial and gender specific.
The Page Act is spectacularly successful at keeping women out. Not because all women coming were prostitutes, although some were, but because the interrogation of the female arrivals was so horrific that once you hear about this, you don't want to try it. So female immigration plummets.
The impact of the Page Act was immediate and dramatic. In 1870, there were only 78 Chinese women in America for every 1,000 Chinese men. By the end of the decade, there were just 47.
When the United States Congress passes the Page Act in 1875, and it bans most women, except merchants' wives, from entering the country, that's ethnic cleansing. Without women, there won't be family, progeny, lineage, children. And so the population will just die off. And it was intended to die off.
By 1876, a starkly reconsolidated white racial calculus was on the rise across America, from the streets of San Francisco to the halls of Congress. That year, Reconstruction would collapse entirely in the bitterly contested presidential election of 1876, when Republicans in Congress, choosing self-interest over justice and equal rights, agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in a backroom deal that sent their party's nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, to the White House, even though he had lost the popular vote to his Democratic rival, Samuel Tilden. During the campaign itself, platforms of both major parties openly called for excluding Chinese.
It came at a time
when American politics was sort of balanced on a knife's edge between Republicans and Democrats. If you look at the period between 1876 and 1896, you have 5 presidential elections in that period. They were all very close. The 1876 election, in which the winner of the Electoral College and the winner of the popular vote were different, the difference in the Electoral College was 1 vote. Now, California had 6 electoral votes. Maybe they're decisive. Oregon had 3. Nevada had 3. Maybe they're decisive. So the pandering for political support from the Pacific Coast votes converts what would have been a local issue with local agitation into a national political issue.
Legitimized by recent federal legislation and the stunning outcome of the 1876 election, a rising tide of political reaction now washed back across the country to California.
The minute the Northern troops are withdrawn from the South and Reconstruction falls apart, and the South is voting again in Congress and can take apart the civil rights victories of the Civil War, it becomes an invitation to race wars.
So you have in California a political movement for exclusion. You have all this legislation going on, you have violence, you had gangs of kids that would throw rocks at the wagons of Chinese arriving from the docks on their way to Chinatown. They'd stand on the bridge and throw rocks at people or spit upon them. It was horrific. And then Chinese become the target of a so-called working men's party and a working men's movement. Dennis Kearney, a recently naturalized Irishman, emerges as a leader of the Working Men's Party in San Francisco.
He was very effective in pointing to Chinese immigrant men, male laborers, as being the source of the white workers' trouble because the Chinese immigrant was the tool. He was the slave of the fat cat industrialist boss who was exploiting workers, not paying a living wage, and out to prevent white workers from gaining their fair share.
As the Working Men's Party movement and kind of class hostility builds, the first demand is down with the monopolists, because the monopolists are the ones seen as increasingly hiring the Chinese and gaining their power from the Chinese. And the second demand is the Chinese must go.
And they have sandlot rallies with incendiary speeches, and their slogan is "The Chinese must go." And Kearney would rile up these crowds, and after the rallies, people would fan out into the streets and they would burn down Chinese wash houses and attack any poor soul that would happen to be on the street. And mobs of hundreds of people would roam the city of San Francisco. They tried to burn down the Pacific Mail steamship docks, which is where most of the Chinese arrived. They couldn't get into the shipyard, so they burned down the lumber yard next to it, hoping that they would burn down the shipyard as well. It was just utter chaos. And the city of San Francisco actually had to dispatch police and citizens groups to hold back these mobs.
And now in Congress, the firewall of Republican opposition itself began to crumble.
So finally, the issue had been agitated for such a long time, and the political impact of the issue had taken root in the Congress, that you got the 1879 15 passenger bill. That was a bill that said that there could not be more than 15 passengers of Chinese background on any ship entering the United States. Otherwise, the ship would be turned back and the captain would be fined, and so on and so forth. In the first major debate in the Congress on the 1879 15 passenger bill, Senator James G. Blaine of Maine broke from the Northeastern Republicans, who basically opposed Chinese exclusion, to support exclusion. His theory was, if you had people who could not assimilate and become part of the body politic, and therefore should not become American citizens, then you also should not permit them to immigrate. Because if you allowed them to immigrate, you would always have a political underclass, seething with resentment, unable to enjoy the full fruits of the American dream. That, he said, would create social problems for the country. So better not to let them come at all. Senator Blaine makes this statement: "We have today to decide whether we shall have on the Pacific coast of the United States the kingdom of Christ or the kingdom of Confucius." So a choice had to be made: restrict immigration and restrict citizenship rights, or give the Pacific coast over to an alien culture and an unassimilable population unfit for citizenship. Now, the 15-passenger bill ultimately got vetoed because President Rutherford Hayes, on the advice of his Secretary of State, said, "We have treaties with China, the Burlingame Treaty specifically, that appears to allow for the free movement of peoples between China and the United States. And the 1879 legislation violates the treaty." People in the Congress knew it violated the treaty. And at the same time, however, President Hayes then sent a delegation to China to renegotiate the Burlingame Treaty so that some kind of legislation could pass. And that negotiation gave the United States the right to restrict or to suspend immigration of Chinese labor. Chinese government really didn't want that treaty. America pushed it on them. China objected, but America assured them that the treaty would be administered in a fair way. So in April of 1882, when they passed a 20-year Exclusion Act, which essentially barred an entire generation of Chinese labor from coming into the United States, that evoked a veto from President Chester Arthur. And then Congress came back very shortly thereafter with a 10-year bill. And at that point, President Arthur said, "Look, this is apparently the will of the Congress. 10 years is not as offensive as 20 years. And he didn't exercise the veto pen again. And May 6, 1882, the legislation becomes law. I dare say that people who voted for the Chinese exclusion laws, who came from Ohio, or Michigan, or Minnesota, probably never saw a Chinese person at the time they voted for those laws. And certainly the southern states were full of people who had never seen Chinese people either. Southern senators and congressmen voted for Chinese exclusion, not because they had a Chinese issue within their own constituency, but because they felt if they tuned themselves to the political exclusionary interests on the Pacific coast, they would gain sympathy for what they wanted to do in their own region of the country to voters of African background, which is disenfranchise them. The fundamental point is, you have your problem and we have our problem. We'll support you, you support us. It was an argument against civil rights. It was an argument against immigration. But there was still lots of dissension in the Congress against barring immigration, and there was absolutely dissension against barring naturalization. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, Abraham Lincoln's first vice president, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was very opposed to it. And on the floor of the Senate, he denounced it. And he said, "I'm opposed to this. It violates fundamental American principles." And he says, "I leave my vote, the last legacy to my children, that they may esteem it the brightest act of my life." This is a person with enormous moral authority. So, as the Congress acted, the voices of dissent were not muted. They were in fact active, eloquent, prominent, and ultimately insufficient. So, anything that the Congress did in these years was not by accident. It really did two things. One was an exclusion from immigration, and the other thing was an exclusion from citizenship. There were Chinese that were legally in the United States, coming from the time of the California Gold Rush, and then in much greater numbers in connection with the construction of the Transcontinental Railway. So at the time, there were approximately 105,000 Chinese in America. Now, they were just 0.2% of the overall American population. So what happens to the people who are already here, people legally in the United States? And what that law said was these people cannot assimilate. They are too different in terms of their culture, in terms of their appearance, in terms of their language, the clothes that they wear, and the food that they eat, and the gods that they worship. They cannot assimilate into the American population, and in that sense, they are different from European immigrants. So we're going to make, as a Congress, a judgment. We're going to say that because they are an unassimilable population, they cannot come to the United States, and those who are here cannot become American citizens.
Once exclusion was the law of the land, then Chinese immigrants turned to trying to figure out how to open up avenues within the laws. We know how active Chinese immigrants were in resisting, protesting, challenging these laws by every means possible. By writing to presidents, talking about the injustice in the newspapers, and taking cases to court.
You see people immediately taking up the pen and writing essays. You have Chinese intellectuals who are here in the United States during this period, like Wang Qingfu, for example, who writes and decries the Chinese Exclusion Act as, anathema to American values, and says, why are you particularly persecuting the Chinese?
Wang Qingfu on the East Coast organized the first Chinese-American civil rights organization to advocate for the Chinese. If there's a hero for me in Chinese-American history, he would be the first one on my list because he was totally fearless and very articulate, and he used American rhetoric and ideas to challenge the exclusion law.
He started a newspaper called the Chinese American, the first time that term was ever used. And he thought the Chinese would become American and should vote. And this is a country that Chinese should settle.
What made the Chinese survive the most difficult conditions in this country is mainly their identification with American founding principles, and also their faith in themselves. And they refused to be excluded.
No nation can afford to let go its high ideals. The founders of the American Republic asserted the principle that all men are created equal and made this fair land a refuge for the whole world. Its manifest destiny, therefore, is to be the teacher and leader of nations in liberty. Its supremacy should be maintained by good faith and righteous dealing, and not by the display of selfishness and greed. But now, looking at the actions of this generation of Americans in their treatment of other races, who can get rid of the idea that that nation, which Abraham Lincoln said was conceived in liberty, waxed great through oppression, and was really dedicated to the proposition that all men are created to prey on one another? How far this republic has departed from its high ideals and reversed its traditionary policy may be seen in the laws passed against the Chinese. Yang Fo Li, The Chinese Must Stay, The North American Review.
This is the basic theme in Chinese American history. The Chinese Americans always challenge the anti-Chinese act and policies. They always appeal to the American judiciary system to protect their rights. Under the most difficult conditions, these people actually did not give up their faith. They fought. They fought for decades. It is a remarkable resilience.
Between the Exclusion Law 1882 and 1905, there were more than 10,000 lawsuits the Chinese filed with the federal courts. And about 20 of these went to the Supreme Court. And the population of Chinese in America was about 110,000 at the time. This is 8-9% of the people sued the federal government to change this.
Chinese used the courts in large part because they didn't have access to the ballot box. They didn't have the vote. But they knew they could use the courts, so this becomes their principal strategy for legal change. And from the 1880s through the end of the 19th century, there are a slew of constitutional cases. One type has to do with immigration, and the other type has to do with civil rights. They mostly lose the immigration cases. But in the question of civil rights, it's a little more mixed. The most famous civil rights case is Yik Wo v. Hopkins in 1886. That's the laundry case, where San Francisco had passed an ordinance that said nobody could have a wooden structure for a laundry, but if it had been built before that time, you could still operate it if you had a permit. And they just refused to give permits to Chinese, but they gave permits to whites.
Right away, 280 laundries applied, and 80 got their permit, 200 did not. The problem was all 80 were white and all 200 were Chinese. Now, there was this guy named San Li. He had his laundry called Yik Wo. And he stood up and said, I'm going to operate without this permit and be arrested to test this law. So he was arrested. The Chinese Six Company and the Laundry Association backed him. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, saying that although a law is good on its surface, if it applied differently to different groups of people, is against the 14th Amendment, which provide equal protection under the law. It was never tested before.
The idea of a Chinese person being harassed, seeking the courts at remedy, at the same time that his people are being excluded from the country, to mix ethnic metaphor shows a lot of chutzpah. And Yik Wo pulled it off. He pulled it off.
And this is a really important case because the court said, first, that the 14th Amendment provision for equal protection applies to all persons. That's the language of the amendment. Not just citizens, not just whites, all persons. So this is the key ruling that applies the 14th Amendment to aliens, to immigrants.
Soon, an even more fateful and fundamental legal battle was underway over the very definition of citizenship in America.
Wong Kim-ark was a native-born American born of Chinese immigrant parents in California in the 1870s. He had made several trips to China a few times before, but in 1894 he goes again, and he comes back through San Francisco. And at that time, the San Francisco Collector of Customs is a well-known anti-Chinese opponent named John Wise. And he was eager for a test case to have the US government consider, is there such a thing as a native-born Chinese American who can be a US citizen if his parents are ineligible for citizenship under the nation's naturalization laws? So even though Wong Kim-ark had been allowed to re-enter the United States a few times before, as a native citizen born in the United States, John Wise decides to deny him re-entry in 1894.
At stake was a bedrock constitutional issue. Under the 14th Amendment, could a Chinese American born in the U.S. of immigrant parents be considered an American citizen or not? The U.S. attorney, arguing the government's case, insisted that even though Wong Kim Ark had been born in the United States, it was an accident of birth that did not override the fact that his parents were foreigners, ineligible for citizenship.
Wong Kim Ark fought it all the way to the Supreme Court to establish something that we take for granted today.
In 1898, in a landmark ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court, citing the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, ruled that Wong Kim Ark, like anyone else born on American soil, was an American citizen.
And this is the case, this is the precedent that establishes a U.S. birthright citizenship for all.
Wong Kim Ark of 1898 is really important because it secures the citizenship status of Chinese born in the United States and all children born of immigrants in the United States. The court said that the language of the 14th Amendment is plain, and if you started to tinker with it, you would jeopardize the citizenship of all the children of Europeans in this country. So it was not necessarily out of any love for Chinese people, but an understanding of what the implications would be more broadly.
With the passage of time, memories of the Chinese exclusion era, so painful for Chinese Americans themselves, faded from public view and were forgotten. In a nation that now preferred to think of itself, in principle at least, as having always welcomed immigrants.
Those of us who are descendants of paper sons and discovering that you're a descendant of a paper son. That generation, my generation, who did not know that our grandfathers were paper sons, because it was a secret that were kept in our families and never talked about. And then one day, perhaps before a funeral or before a birthday party or something is said that lets everyone know, and you realize, oh, that's why we never talk about him, or oh, that's why that family in Chinatown is related to us, but we can't figure out why or something. It's because of that legacy of exclusion and getting around exclusion. And once you realize that, then that sense of alienation, perhaps, or that sense of understanding that you are a legacy of exclusion hits you. And you realize, oh, I'm part of that long history of immigration, exclusion, assimilation, acculturation, or marginalization. All of those processes that take place has its seeds in exclusion. It made me feel even more part of that flow of generations of that Chinese experience in America. And for those generations who came after, who didn't have to face exclusion, I don't think they fully understand that because they never had to deal with it.
We only have to pick up a newspaper or listen to the news or read a blog about immigration today to understand why immigration is a complicated matter in the United States. The history of Chinese exclusion highlights that we have had a complicated relationship about immigration from the very beginning. And that it's that duality of welcoming immigrants, of understanding their need, our dependence on them, how they contribute to the United States, as well as our fear and anxiety of the different changing demographics, changing economic structure, that has made us who we are. That duality and our complicated relationship of immigration has shaped who we are as a nation. It shaped our economy, our society, our politics, and it continues to shape our ongoing understanding of what it means to be an American and how we continue to debate that to this day.
Gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of House Resolution 683. Today, for the first time in 130 years, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that expresses regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history. Over a century ago, the Chinese came here in search of a better life. During the California...
When we look back, I think we can learn that the Chinese have this resilient faith in the founding principles. I think that's Chinese Americans' contribution to this grand American experiment. The exclusion law can be seen as a fundamental flaw, a huge mistake in that historical process of great experiment. I think if you really look at this system, you can also say that, the exclusion law was democratic, was legal, but it was wrong. So something wrong could be done in that process of building a democratic system there. On the other hand, even under the enormous difficult circumstances, with so many disillusions, so many disappointment, and so much suffering, generations of Chinese Americans never give up their faith and their hope. I think that's very remarkable.
Over. I'm gonna go to the other room, okay? All right. I can hear better and be seen better and all that. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I will ask folks to mute themselves right now. We would like to welcome the directors, who I am now going to spotlight, to say a few words after we have screened that.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Yes, indeed. And apologies that it was my fault, got the start time wrong, so we were not here to greet you before the clip. But here we are. We are so honored and pleased to be part of our discussion here, as you can all feel that this is still very much a topical issue that we should continue to be thinking about and talking about, and understand this history so we know how we want to comport ourselves moving forward.
Hear, hear.
Right? Yeah.
So we have a few, first of all, I invite the audience to ask questions, put them in the chat. Sometimes this takes a few minutes to kind of germinate and marinate, especially after watching something so comprehensive and multifaceted like we just did. We have a few questions, myself and some of the co-organizers, to kind of start us off. So maybe I'll start with just one question. there's not a lot of information about the Chinese Exclusion Act, writes someone. How did you gather the materials, the documents, the pictures, etc., to make this? It was a huge amount of work. So sort of how you gathered them and how much time it took to sort of put this magnum opus together.
Well, you know, the project began around 2012 when a wonderful person, Louise Mirror, who's the president of the New York Historical Society, had conceived with her colleagues at the Society of doing an exhibit about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Louise Mirror looked to Li Xin and me and said, would we make a film which would be a kind of a companion piece to it? And what was really remarkable was that, and so fortunate for the project, was that the society itself had already assembled basically the A team, the killer team of historians who know this subject inside and out. And so we kind of in saying yes, we immediately acquired this really incredible group of scholars and writers, almost all of whom you saw on screen, as they were not only consultants to the project, but became on-screen interviewees. And so we began in 2012 because we are, I am at least, the slow boat, not the fast boat. It took us, a number of years to do it. The Society's exhibit came out in 2014. And I'll just say, and then turn it over to you, Li Xin. It was interesting that when the exhibit came out, it was called Chinese Exclusion / Inclusion, because there was feeling on the part, sadly, that you didn't want to be too negative about this topic. And we were glad that our film wasn't ready then, because we then doubled down and said, this is a film that's going to be called the Chinese Exclusion Act. To be sure, inclusion has been part of the Chinese experience in America, but our film is about this and where it came from. So that was, we continued on our way, and the film came out about 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's one of our first meeting at the New York Historical Society. We were assembled with 4 scholars, and they were Scott Wang, Mei Nai, Mary Liu, Ren Qiu, and Jack Chen, the 5 major hitter. And it was during that meeting that Scott Wang said, I'm really appreciative of the resources that the Historical Society allow researchers like ourselves. And he brought out a document, which is the opening document that we opened the film in Samsung Bo and his experience. And Ren Qiu said, yes, 15 years ago, I translated that original English document back into Chinese so that all people can experience, what a Chinese person living through that period was feeling and going through, and the fierce resistance voice, that was alive even back then. So it's the research, yes, a lot of research, but so much of it came from our scholars.
Because this is the golden age. The last 10 years has been the golden age for this research, in which, as you were saying, Nora, that, this stuff is, Li Xin said in the middle of the project, the archives, the documents are the heroes of the project. This incredible thing, the most humble and simple ID papers and, photographs and ID tags and things like that, which had to be assembled by largely this group of people who became, the brain trust of our film, without which you really couldn't tell the story, and why we were really intent on showing those documents so that you could see them. So it has a kind of I hope it has this sort of kind of a bureaucratic immediacy to see, see how this thing went down.
Yeah, but it's also for us to film it in a, people think a document is a 2-dimensional item, but it is something you can hold in your hand. And to see that piece of paper from 100 years ago, it really hits home sort of how potent, this is a reminder of these artifacts live through this history, so to speak, and, we try to film in a three-dimensional context so that that power really punches through.
I am definitely seeing a lot of questions in the chat and I want to get to them. And I want to back up for just one moment. I know that we didn't have introductions at the beginning and you know Wei Han as well. I'm Leora Norwich. I'm the director of the Network for Social Justice, one of the organizations that have brought you here. And I have the privilege of doing the moderating of this panel. I also want to back up just to give you both, Lu Chen and Rick, a chance to introduce yourselves and say how you came together to work on this film. And then we're going to go back to the questions.
My name is Rick Burdens. I'm a documentary filmmaker. And I've had the incredibly good fortune of, since 1993, when I first met Li Shenyu, to be working with her over the course of, 3 or 4 decades now. It's been, no film I've worked on since 1993 has been, untransformed by Li Shen. So, it's been a really...
No, it's been a great decades and decades of collaboration. We thought of making a film about the Snake River Massacre, which is not in this clip, but in the long, full film. And, over time, we kind of toyed with the idea of doing that story and never got around to it because other projects came up. And when this idea came to us, we just immediately looked at each other and go, no brainer, we have to do this now. And I think in retrospect, I'm really glad to not have done the Snake River film like in the 90s, because I think all these decades working with Rick, not only that the world changed around us, but also my understanding of learning from Rick on how events in history are all related. That this story is not this niche Chinese American history, it's all of America's history. We cannot fully understand who we are without understanding this history. So for me to have had all this long history of working with Rick on various aspects of American history, really, I think, help us hone this one for all Americans to understand this is part of
just
story.
to give the tiniest window into that, because it wasn't included in this clip, in what you saw tonight, is that, when the American Revolution was done, in 1783, the first ship that left New York Harbor was a ship called the Empress of China, headed for Shanghai. And the reason why it was Hong Kong, thank you. And the reason why it was headed for Hong Kong was because the British, having said, okay, errant colonists, go your own way, now did not allow them to trade within the British Commonwealth. And so the first way in which the American economy had some kind of sustenance was through its trade with China. So the China trade was really crucial to the American experiment from the moment we got up and tried to walk for the first time. And so you see that this, the idea that, the Chinese must go, or excluding, we've been so knit in, of course, since long before 1882, to a global experience, and understanding that relationship and drawing those, connecting the dots in that respect, I think was crucial to the sense we had, tutored by our amazing scholars of how to see and understand this story as it unfolds over not just a few years in the 1880s, but goes back to the 18th century, and of course comes right down to today.
So that's some of the impetus. I think those are a lot of the questions that I had about the impetus of bringing this and what's moving us forward and relevant for today, and the showing and the reshowing and the telling and the retelling. There are a lot of questions here in the chat, so I am going to get to some of the questions now. Helen Yang asks, Asian Americans are often considered perpetual foreigners, which contributes to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which in turn strengthened this stereotype. This perpetual foreigner bias has fueled the Japanese internment in World War II, the murder of Vincent Chen, and the recent anti-Asian hate crimes. What do you think we should be doing to combat this perception?
Yeah, I think for me, it's sort of understanding this history. I know as a young person, I had just gotten my citizenship in the 80s when the Vincent case blew up. And it was a moment of like real confusion for me as a young person, like I just became a citizen, but do I belong? Doesn't seem like anybody wants me here. All of those things that as you struggle to find yourself, if you understood the history, you can understand and place where some of these hatred comes from, or erroneous ideas or assignation that is given to us. Then you can better ground yourself and say, well, no, and have that voice of to resist or speak up or stake your claim as much as anybody else here. For me, working in history, that really helped me understand, who we are. Is history repeating itself? Maybe it's not actually repeating itself. We never really quite understood where we are. So we can't, stake our ground and say, well, this is not where we want to be. So how do we take the next step to, kind of get to where we actually want to be?
Also, I'd just say, as a kind of a postscript to what Liu Shen just said so eloquently, another hero of the story is the 14th Amendment. Where we go, we're so proud, justifiably, of the Constitution of the United States, but it was an extraordinarily flawed document, as Dred Scott in 1857 showed. And so, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, what's called the Civil War Amendments, which were passed finally over very, very heated struggle in the late 1860s, were explicitly an attempt, the 13th, to free all African people of African descent from slavery, abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment, which included the Equal Protection Clause, applicable to all persons. You did not have to be a citizen. All citizens, but all people were included with that. And then the 15th Amendment, which extended the franchise to Black men in America. The 14th Amendment, I would say, is the most crucial aspect of the document that we have. And it's the one that is most salient. It's the one from which, its progeny over the last 150 years in American jurisprudence, at the Supreme Court level, but at every level, has been absolutely crucial to make sure that the invidious distinctions which are applied de facto and sometimes de jure before it are, that there is some method of resisting that. So I would say, it has been the people like Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants and people of African-American descent again and again and again, and many others who have been outsiders and had the experience of outsiders who have looked to the documents, including those crucial amendments, and maybe above all the 14th, and said, you know what? This language has been knit into and absolutely seared into the conscience of the American experience. We're going to make these words read in the words that they're written in. And that means that these people who are so frequently thought of as outsiders are the real Americans. They're the ones who they are our moral guides. And the reason why we have a country which is not falling completely apart in 2021 is because time and again, people who were excluded from a full access to the quote unquote American dream said, bullshit. And we're going to take this one to court, as the Chinese did 10,000 times in that remarkable statistic. So I think, we are living through a continuation of what's been a 225-year civil war. And we got to remember we have tools to fight that war with. And they're not tools protected by the Second Amendment. They're tools in lovely script enshrined in the documents of, not just the founding quote unquote fathers, but people who struggled and died and put their lives on the line and have pushed this experiment forward. So we're now at a key inflection point in that experiment.
So interestingly, I think this next question relates directly to what you were just talking about. which is, you were very careful about what you were including in the film, and it sounds like there were some really hard decisions to make. How did you decide what to leave out on the cutting room floor, given the volume of information that you were dealing with and the document you were trying to create, like this really like the document of the documentary?
It was a tough one. I mean, our final film was actually 2 hours and 40 minutes, which we had to pare down to 110 minutes for the PBS broadcast. So it was, at the time, I think it was like 2 hour 40. How can we even bring it down to 110 minutes? But, frankly, I don't remember how we did it. we
That's
did
because
it.
I can remember, because Li Xin is, among many things, she's a director and she's also an editor. And the qualities that editors have when they're as extraordinary as Li Xin is they have a kind of an almost infinitely deep, still pool of responsiveness, and they're completely unsentimental at the same time. And so, the cliche, you're gonna have to shoot a lot of your babies when you get into this business. Li Xin, sweet-looking human being that she is, and she is in many ways a sweet person, is capable entirely of saying, "That's going," and I don't have that, that talent in the same abundance. So one of the things that's been so great for me working with her is having someone who's equally responsive, more responsive to the potential power of the material, but really gimlet-eyed about what's working best in the interest of this particular film. And so, armed with a co-director and a colleague like Li Xin, we were able to wade our through. So in other words, she carries the machete.
No, I mean, it's like there are many stories. For example, in the longer version, we get to meet the tapes, who fought for their daughter to go to the public school. We meet them, as young immigrants. They both came as a very young age, and how they sort of established themselves and really wanted to be Americans, fought against, exclusionary laws and established themselves. Those kinds of, that story is not in the broadcast version, as are many other sort of more personal individual stories. But in the end, the choice was to keep them in, or to really fully understand the sweep of the forces that, enacted this amazing piece of legislation and its impact. That after the act was passed, in fact, it gave license for the incredible violence that took place across the West, and sort of those things became kind of more, not more important, but it was something that we wanted to focus on more, rather than some of the more personal stories, which we were sad to lose, but it was a choice that we had to make.
So some of the questions that we're getting here are, where can we feed the full film? For sure. And some of the questions are, how can we broaden the venue for this? How can we get this out to a wider audience? I think added to those questions, and one of the questions that we had generated ahead of time is, what was the reception for this film like? How did you roll this out? How was it shown? What was the response initially? And sort of what are plans moving forward?
Right. Well, we had the good fortune to work with CAM, Center of Asian American Media, based in San Francisco. And they, we were the closeout film for their film festival that year. They put us in this amazing Castro theater, 1,300 seat, refurbished old theater.
Not an empty seat.
Not an empty seat, sold out, waiting line. And 2 hours, 40 minutes seemed to have went by like a blink of an eye. Granted, this is a San Francisco crowd, these are descendants of people of this history, direct descendants of this history. And so it was an incredible response. And we also have the great fortune of having a CPB grant to do an outreach program. So we had CAM spearheaded this outreach program across the country. You know, it was shown with events such as tonight. At the time, we were able to attend, you know, a dozen, 2 dozens of them individually, collectively, to just, you know, and CAM also has a educational component to this that people can access to use in schools. And so all of those things are still happening. And
CAM is really still, I mean, Stephen Gong and Don Young were the kind of the sort of the two remarkable people at the top of the CAM organization, which is small but swift and incredibly creative. You know, anybody who has an idea to do some kind of public event, you know, reach out to Li Xin, reach out to me, reach out to Stephen Gong and Don Young at Center for Asian American Media. And, you know, in a heartbeat, you know, I know that, you know, all of the above, you know, would be really, really enthusiastic to do something. I mean, it was great that it was, you know, PBS, American Experience, where, you know, it was an amazing kind of broadcast platform when the film came out a few years ago in May. And to have had the support of, you know, the lead public television station in the country, WGBH, and PBS, who were really so thoroughly behind it. And what was amazing was that the project started, you know, well before the events of the last few years, in which so many of these themes have come out again. I mean, I'm sitting in a building near my own on the Upper West Side of Manhattan with Li Xin, who a year ago was verbally assaulted on the streets on Broadway for being Asian American in the crudest possible way. And so, you know, this film came out and began to hit the public, you know, before this tremendous kind of additional chapter, newest chapter of anti-Asian sentiment, you know, fueled by deep, deep racism in America, and also, of course, by the pandemic. So, you know, it is sad to say, an evergreen topic. And so, you know, we'll only have to wait another few days, weeks, or months, and something else will occur to make it necessary to double down and triple down and quadruple down on this message, because, you know, hip, hip, hooray, the Chinese are excluded. That turns out to be remarkably contemporary mood, not just something that goes back to the 1880s.
And the film is available for purchase from pbs.org.
Right.
I do direct people to it at the very end. We have it on a slide. I think you're both speaking to the direction that the questions are moving in. So sort of as our last segment of questions, I see one question from Taylor. Speaking of violence in March 2021, the group API data estimated that up to 2 million hate incidents happened since the pandemic. What are your thoughts on the parallel between this and the Great Dividing Out in the 1880s? And I'm going to make this a two-part question. And what can individuals do right now? You know, we're a social and racial justice organization. There's a lot of folks on this call who are thinking exact in terms of sort of activism, next steps, where we're going. What are the parallels and what can we be doing?
You know, I'll go ahead, Lishan.
No, I was just thinking, you know, the sort of hate rhetoric that came from above, as in the passage of the Exclusion Act, really gave people permission to act out their basest, hideous instincts. And I think we are seeing that yet again. You know, it's as Rick was saying, you know, in our liberal bubble of the Upper West Side, you know, I was out cheering, you know, our 7 p.m. cheering of the healthcare worker. I got verbally assaulted. I mean, it was shocking. I was shaken for days. and this thing is that it affects everyone, whether that event happens to you or not. We all feel it, and it is, I think educating people, talk to people you may not normally perhaps have a conversation with, engage, because I think once you have person-to-person engagement, walls will start coming down. You will begin to see people not as a cutout stereotype, but as a human being, more like yourself than not. The more we can do that on all levels, we will hopefully begin to crumble this wall of hatred. That is one sort of very personal way, and there are many organizations such as yours to get involved in to stay active and educate.
As being kind of an amateur student of history, for a long time now, which is kind of what you get to be as a historical documentary filmmaker. There's no question that we're living through a moment when every time in American history when what W.E.B. Du Bois called the wages of whiteness, which is what white people get. And by the way, I'm not a self-hating white person. I like myself. I like white people. Many people are some of my closest friends. But whenever the wages of whiteness are threatened, there is a tremendous backlash. And they were threatened at the time of the American Revolution. And they were threatened at the American Civil War. And then look what happened to Reconstruction. And they were threatened again and again in the 20th century. And they're under threat now. The threat is not coming from legal structures. The legal basis, thank goodness, is there for the most part. But as someone once said in connection with a film that Alicia and I were working on about the history of African Americans on the road during the Jim Crow era, you can't legislate treatment. You can't create laws on how people are going to be treated and regarded. So let's think of ourselves as in the treatment phase of the civil rights movement. The language of the civil rights is there. And now it's about, as Lishan was saying, creating an environment in which shared experience can be understood. Unfortunately, or rather, maybe it's just the way things are. Understanding the degree to which these things, critical race theory, systemic racism, anybody who wants to say those things are not deep, active parts continuing today in the American experience are themselves either woefully ignorant or proactively racist. We live in a racist society. It has been there all along, and we're experiencing a particular backlash right now. And so, I think what we can do is we can go out and go sometimes it's not like what Thomas Jefferson said, every now and then the tree of liberty needs to be watered by the blood of patriots. I don't mean that something quite so melodramatic, but every now and then one has to realize, this is a time to stand up, to go out in the streets, to engage in dialogue, and to find ways to make it clear that this is not a new problem. This is a contemporary, present day version of something which is deep and needs to be addressed. And I think that, we'll see where this takes us. But I think that living in this very, very divisive and complex moment, I don't think we know any more where this is going than people did in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. And it's time for people to really, think deeply about what their values are and stand up and act on them.
So you've both taken us on a journey tonight. I mean, I've been trying to write while listening, and that's been very hard, but bureaucratic immediacy, which is sort of one of the phrases that you started us with tonight, to the wages of whiteness, to sharing your own experience on the streets of New York. What would you like to leave us with as a last thought?
May Nye, Renshaw Yu, David Liu, Scott Wong, Erica Lee, Martin Gold, Gene Feltzer, this remarkable cadre of people, most of them Asian American, not all of them, who, these are men and women who've given their lives of study and caring to this topic, and I've just named, maybe half of them, but there's another amazing group that's in there. And I listen to them and I hear the kind of, it's not world weary, but the deeply seasoned experience of a scholar like Mei Nai, who's actually like right now sitting in her apartment about 5 blocks away from us up at Columbia University in New York. And think of these men and women who are the custodians of this knowledge and who, without which we lose it all. And I feel such gratitude to them and know that we all are forever in their debt. And they're working away, they're paid for their work, but they're working away usually without any kind of like public recognition. They have institutional recognition. But man, we would be screwed without, I mean that not just us, but collectively as a society without this body of knowledge. So, next time you want to say, oh, these kind of elite institutions, the elite institutions, quote unquote, are the ones which have systematically over centuries preserved the record of what happens, so that when you want to turn to fact and data instead of abusive opinion and prejudice, you have something you can actually point to. So I take enormous courage from people like Ren-Sho Yu, who's the last person you saw, who said an amazing thing in the film. And that's why Lisha and I ended with it. Chinese Exclusion Act shows you something can be democratic, it can be legal, and it can be wrong.
Yeah, I think, I think also the takeaway is that this is also a very inspirational story when you see the resistance from the very, very beginning, from the get-go, when 1852, there was the Chinese never sat back and take it as the stereotype of Asians are. We spoke up, we stood up for our rights, we understood what those rights were, and we weren't going to take it sitting down. So I think that is a lesson, I think, for especially young people to take to heart and know that it can be done. It's not going to be easy, but we have to keep at it. And I think that is kind of the inspiration I take from making this film.
Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. I've been taking notes myself. I know people are thanking you on the chat as well of just how powerful this documentary is and how they're excited to share it with their families and their kids. Everyone's just saying thank you. And I wanted, thank you so much for being with us. And I wanted to turn it back over to our sponsors to do something which I think is in the spirit of the documentary, which is share a little bit about what's going on in their communities and in terms of how this can impact legislation that we are currently working on with our organizations. So with that, I wanted to turn it back over to Wei Han to say a few words. As well, and then the Winchester Historical Society. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me, and finally to the network.
Okay, yeah, I would start by saying that to echo what Director Yu mentioned, that how to get involved, participate, has been our organization's goal to encourage Chinese and Asian Americans to engage civic duty here, very locally. As they're saying that all politics are local. Start from local and get involved. And in New England, there are plenty of self-governing committees and boards that for residents that to join, and that's a great starting point. And even you can start with little steps. Get involved in the school's PTO, the parent associations, and get your voice heard. Participate. And a couple more things I want to mention, because I got so many questions on how to view the full versions. And of course, it's being sold from PBS website. It comes in the DVD format. So don't throw out your DVD players yet. You still need it. And this fabulous documentary is I mean, I cannot thank both Director Yu and Director Burns enough for making this possible. That now we have this marvelous documentary film that we can educate ourselves, educate our children, our students, and our communities. It's just it's make it so much easier. And the Chinese American network Winchester, we will purchase a few copies of this film and donate it to Winchester Public Library, and that you can check it out. And of course, if you want to keep it, just purchase from PBS directly. But I think once we put these DVDs into the minimum library system, pretty much all cities and towns in Boston area can check them out. So hopefully that, this great film can reach out to a lot more people, because it's just amazing that, a few features that you did not see tonight, and it was included in the full version. Like, for example, there's a Massachusetts Senator George Frisbee Howard was standing up against this act, actually all 15 of those laws that, for the Chinese exclusion, he was there saying it's un-American. And I think even at one vote, he was the only one voted no on that occasion. It was incredible. And I'm so proud, that we are in Massachusetts and we have this great tradition, and, that we have legislators that's really, unprecedented, that have that mind, that, we're still so grateful, 150 years later. And actually there are many Chinese Americans in Boston area go to his graveyard in Concord, pay respects to him until, even today. Yeah. So, no, please, I encourage all of you to look at the full version of the film, and there are tons of, features in it. And also that I encourage you all that participate all the activities and meetings in our town and in our Boston area, that get our voice heard and stand up and speak out. Thank you.
So we're going to ask Electra as well from the Winchester Historical Society to say a few words.
Hello there. Thank you both. Let me add my thanks. This was wonderful. Not only did we all, I think, learn something that and when we started this conversation, I want to credit Hilda Wang Du, who's on the call, to bring this topic up, saying, why didn't we learn about this? And she's like, we need to do something about this. And so she was an enormous catalyst for why we're all together tonight. So I do want to do a shout out to Hilda for getting the ball rolling. But yeah, so we all learned something, and I think we were all very much inspired by the story, and it gives hope to what we can be doing all today. And I definitely love the notion of let's look and find the humanity in each other. And that is how that we are always so much more alike than we are in terms of our differences. And that's a powerful way that we can all do something tomorrow and be a part of a wonderful change. So thank you. This was a wonderful evening. The Historical Society has a couple of other programs coming up shortly. One is the story on October 18th, and this is about a local hero, Edward Noble, and the work that he did to help save many people in Poland during the Soviet Poland conflict that happened after World War I. So join us for that wonderful hero of story of a local hero. And we're very, very happy in November on the 17th to have Nancy Cohen back. She is going to dig into Abraham Lincoln, and it's called The Man Behind the Marble. And if you've heard her speak in the past, she is a Harvard professor, and she is a wonderful storyteller. So I hope you'll also check out that program too. And I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Leora, back to you.
Thank you. I am now going to invite Phil Coonley from the Network for Social Justice to share a little bit about what the network is doing in related to legislation.
You might have do you have a slide there you could put up?
I do have a slide here. I actually put the slide deck also in the chat for everyone because it did also have the Winchester Historical Society's upcoming events. So I wanted everyone to see that. Taking a second, I apologize. Here we go. This is the Network for Social Justice and what is happening. Oh, I apologize. And if you also go to this slide, you'll see the upcoming events for the Winchester Historical Society.
Right. Well, I'm proud to be co-chair of the Immigrant Justice Committee of the Network for Social Justice. And it was formed when the Network for Social Justice said, you know, we shouldn't just be responding to individual issues. We should be doing that, but in addition, we should be trying to make some institutional changes. But education has always been part of our process by which we make change, whether it's institutional or at the individual level. So this is so exciting. I was a history major, and I'm embarrassed to say I really had no appreciation for this aspect of the contribution of immigrants, in this case, Chinese Americans, to our fairly robust protection, constitutional protections. It's been very exciting to learn about this. And I hope it gets into every curriculum in high school history classes, and let alone college classes. Anyway, what we've been focusing on, I'm going to back up a little bit. The Afghanistan refugees in Massachusetts, that's something that we're putting a lot of energy into in the next 6 weeks, particularly because it's such an immediate problem, and you'll hear more about that as we try to help people understand what this means for these refugees that are going to be coming, maybe 1,500 or more to Massachusetts, and what some of their special needs are, and what we might do as individuals, either in direct support or financial support. Local voting for non-U.S. citizen residents. Well, one of the ways of affirming an open community to immigrants is by letting them vote in local elections, even before they become U.S. citizens. That's possible in some states already, in some communities. And in Massachusetts, many towns have already said, please give us the opportunity, state legislature, because right now the state law doesn't allow us to do that, to let us have our non-U.S. citizen residents be able to vote. They pay taxes. They're very active in the enabling organizations that make this town great and other towns great. So we need to have them have a voice, we have some support with this from the select board, and I think they're taking a lot of leadership on this and expect it to be a warrant next spring. We're partnering with the League of Women Voters, which is all about expanding voting opportunities, and we're going to be working together to have some positive community outreach. I'm going to skip the next one just for a second. The Safe Community Act is something that the League also supports nationally, but basically that's a state law that's moving ahead, but many towns have already adopted the principles of the Safe Community Act, which really have to do with police treating immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented, like they would any other person that they in their duties, so that the local police aren't seen as the ICE enforcers, so that every immigrant in town can say, wow, I can trust these guys. I can be a witness. I can raise my hand if I see an accident or see some crime. And when everybody in the community feels respected by the police, they end up being much more of the allies, and statistically, it makes the community safer. So the thing I haven't mentioned yet was the human rights statement, and I wanted to just sort of read it to you. Let's see if I can find it here. I want to read it to you because one of our things is to broaden awareness, but it's particularly relevant to tonight's presentation. This is, it reads this way: Winchester is a community that is grounded in respect for every individual and therefore protects all residents, employees, business owners, students, and visitors in the enjoyment and exercise of human and civil rights. It is town policy to ensure equal treatment and opportunity to all individuals, regardless of race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, religion, ideology, socioeconomic status, health, sexual orientation, age, military status, disability, country of origin, or immigration status. Those latter two were added just in May of 2020. And that's one reason the town was able to, with this kind of ideals, it was easy for the town leaders to work with other active organizations like our own in ways. By the way, Way's one of our most active members of the Immigrant Justice Committee too, so he's everywhere. That's why the BLM flag can go up on the common. That's one reason we had a wonderfully moving End Asian Hate Vigil. And it's one reason we're having an event like tonight, which is so inspiring for all of us. So that's what we're up to. We'd love to have anyone who'd like to join us. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. I know we ran a little bit over, but we learned so much. I think people really were able to connect. I see some of the connections that have happened on the chat as well, with people sharing resources. We will share out the slides to anyone who joined tonight, and we've also recorded this experience, so we have it to share out. Thank you again so much for joining us and being part of this experience, and I'm really looking forward to more. Thanks, everybody.